Sarah Martinez never thought watching a man wrap her grandmother's china would make her pulse quicken. But here she was on moving day, stealing glances at Marcus as his large hands cradled each delicate piece like it contained secrets worth protecting. 3 months post-divorce, she'd sworn off men entirely, yet something about the way this stranger treated her broken life with such careful attention made her stomach flutter in ways she'd forgotten were possible. "You don't have to be so gentle with those," she said, leaning against the kitchen doorframe, watching him layer tissue paper between the plates with surgical precision. "Half of them are chipped anyway." Marcus looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers for just a moment before returning to his work. "Chipped doesn't mean worthless," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to fill the hollow spaces in her chest. "Sometimes the broken pieces are the ones worth saving most." The apartment buzzed with the controlled chaos of moving day. His crew worked efficiently around them, voices echoing off bare walls, but Sarah found herself tuned only to Marcus's steady movements. He was different from the others, quieter, more deliberate. Where they hefted boxes with practiced indifference, he paused to read labels, ensuring her books stayed upright, her picture frames faced inward for protection. "You've done this before," she observed, though it wasn't really a question. "More. And times than I can count," he replied, sealing the box with careful strips of tape, but not usually with someone watching every move. Heat crept up Sarah's neck. She hadn't realized how obvious her staring had become. "Sorry, it's strange watching your whole life get packed away by strangers." "We don't have to be strangers," Marcus said, then seemed to catch himself. He cleared his throat, professional mask sliding back into place. "I mean, some clients like to know their moving team. Makes the process feel less invasive." Sarah nodded, though something in his tone suggested he'd meant more than that. She watched him move to the next cabinet, noting how his shoulders filled out his company T-shirt, how his forearms flexed as he lifted her heavy mixer with the same care he'd shown the china. When was the last time someone had handled her belongings, handled anything of hers with such attention? "Sarah Martinez," she said suddenly, extending her hand. He paused, work gloves dusty with cardboard fibers, then pulled one off to take her hand. His palm was warm, calloused from honest work, and when their skin touched, she felt something shift inside her chest like a door she'd bolted shut, creaking open just an inch. "Marcus Thompson," he said, holding her gaze a beat longer than necessary. "Nice to meet you, Sarah." Neither of them let go right away. The apartment felt like a museum after closing hours, all echoes and empty spaces where life used to live. Sarah stood in the center of her former living room, arms wrapped around herself, watching dust motes dance in the late afternoon light that streamed through windows, no longer softened by curtains. The silence pressed against her ears, broken only by the distant sound of Marcus's crew securing the last of her belongings in the truck below. "That's everything," Marcus said from the doorway, his voice gentler than it had been all day. "Trucks, loaded and ready." She nodded but didn't move, her bare feet rooted to the hardwood floor she'd once chosen with such hope. The apartment looked smaller now, vulnerable in its nakedness. Corner marks on the walls showed where her bookshelf had stood, where their wedding photo had hung before she'd packed it away in a box marked garage. "You okay?" Marcus stepped inside, work boots soft against the floor. "I thought I'd be happy to leave," Sarah said, surprising herself with the admission. 3 months ago, I couldn't wait to get out of here. Every room held memories I wanted to escape." Marcus moved closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of his cologne, mixed with honest sweat. "And now? Now it just feels like I'm running away again." She turned to face him, noting how the golden light caught the concern in his dark eyes. "My ex-husband used to say I never finished anything. Maybe he was right. Leaving isn't always running," Marcus said quietly. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully. You sound like you know. I moved out of my childhood home when I was 19, he said, hands clasped behind his back like he was resisting the urge to reach for her. Thought I was abandoning my mom, but she told me later that watching me build my own life was the proudest she'd ever been. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and sharp. What if I don't know how to build anything? What if I just keep breaking things? Marcus took another step closer, and she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Then you start with something small, he said. Something that can't break. Like what? His gaze dropped to her lips for just a moment before meeting her eyes again. Like trust. The word hung between them in the empty room, heavy with possibility and terrifying in its simplicity. The new apartment smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Though Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for either. Sunlight poured through windows that faced east instead of west, casting unfamiliar shadows across hardwood floors that creaked in different places than the ones she'd left behind. She stood in the doorway, clutching her purse like a lifeline, watching Marcus direct his crew with the same careful attention he'd shown her grandmother's china. Living room furniture goes against that wall, he called out, pointing to the space she'd measured 3 times but still wasn't certain about. And ma'am, where do you want the bedroom set? The formal address stung more than it should have. After their moment in the empty apartment, hearing him retreat behind professional boundaries felt like a door closing just as she'd worked up the courage to peek inside. Down the hall, first door on the right, she managed, her voice smaller than intended. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, transforming her possessions from carefully labeled boxes back into the semblance of a life. But everything looked wrong in this new space. Her couch too large for the living room, her dining table awkwardly positioned near a window that would catch too much morning glare. Each piece of furniture seemed to announce that she'd made a mistake, that she wasn't ready for this fresh start she'd convinced herself she wanted. "Hey!" Marcus appeared beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. His crew was taking a water break on the front steps, their voices a distant murmur. "You look like you're about to run." The thought crossed my mind, Sarah admitted, surprised by her own honesty. What if this place never feels like home? What if I'm just playing house in someone else's life? Marcus studied her face with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. "You know what my grandmother used to say? Home isn't the place that fits you perfectly right away. It's the place you're willing to grow into." Something loosened in Sarah's chest at his words. "Your grandmother sounds wise." She was. "Raised me after my dad left." He paused, then seemed to make a decision. "Tell you what, once my crew's done, I could help you arrange things. No charge. Sometimes it just takes a different perspective to see how the pieces fit." The offer hung between them, clearly personal rather than professional. Sarah felt her pulse quicken at the thought of being alone with him in this new space, of having his steady presence help her transform these unfamiliar rooms into something that might eventually feel like sanctuary. "You don't have to do that," she said, though everything in her hoped he'd insist. Marcus smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him all day. "I want to." The apartment had transformed in the 3 hours since Marcus's crew left. Her couch now faced the window at an angle that caught the evening light perfectly, and her bookshelf stood against the wall where it seemed to have always belonged. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, using an unopened box as a makeshift table, chopsticks poised over Thai takeout containers that had appeared when Marcus mentioned he was hungry, and she realized she had no idea where her kitchen utensils were packed. "You were right about the furniture," she said, gesturing with a piece of pad thai toward the newly arranged living room. "Everything looks like it belongs now." Marcus leaned back against the couch, legs stretched out beside her, his work boots traded for socked feet that somehow made the scene feel more intimate than it should. Just took seeing it from a different angle. Sometimes you're too close to the problem to find the solution. The comment felt weighted with meaning beyond furniture arrangement, but neither of them acknowledged it directly. Instead, Sarah watched. The way the lamplight caught the angles of his face, noting how much younger he looked when he smiled, how his shoulders had relaxed as the evening wore on. "So," she said, twirling noodles around her chopsticks, "how does someone end up in the moving business? Childhood dream of lifting heavy objects?" Marcus laughed, a rich sound that seemed to fill the spaces between her still unpacked boxes. "Started helping my uncle during summer breaks in high school. Figured it was temporary, just until I figured out what I really wanted to do." He shrugged. 10 years later, I own the company and still don't know what I really want to do." "That makes two of us," Sarah said quietly. "I was married for 8 years and thought I had everything figured out. Career, house, 5-year plan. Then one day I woke up and realized I'd been living someone else's idea of my life." "What was your idea of your life?" The question caught her off guard. She set down her chopsticks, considering. "I used to write. Stories mostly. Nothing published, just words that felt like mine. My ex thought it was a waste of time since it didn't pay anything." Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the soft light. "What kind of stories?" "About people finding each other. When they least expected it," she said, then felt heat creep up her neck at the admission. "Romantic, I guess. Happy endings and all that fairy tale nonsense." "Doesn't sound like nonsense to me." Their eyes met across the takeout containers, and Sarah felt something shift in the air between them, something that had nothing to do with furniture arrangements and everything to do with the way he looked at her, like her abandoned dreams might actually matter. Sarah had been staring at the same page of her book for 20 minutes when the knock came, soft but deliberate against her front door. Her heart jumped before her mind could catch up, because somehow she knew it would be Marcus, even though she had no logical reason to expect him. She'd been thinking about him for 3 days straight, replaying their conversation over takeout. Containers, remembering the way he'd looked at her when she mentioned her abandoned writing. "Marcus," she said, opening the door to find him standing there with a toolbox in one hand and something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty in his dark eyes. "Hey," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I should check on how everything's settling. Sometimes furniture shifts after a few days, especially on older floors like these." It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of follow-up service that separated good moving companies from great ones. Except Sarah had been walking these floors for 3 days, and nothing had shifted so much as an inch. The couch still sat at the perfect angle he'd positioned it, the bookshelf remained exactly where they'd placed it together, and her dining table hadn't budged from its spot near the window. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "That's very thorough of you." Marcus moved through her living room with the same careful attention he'd shown during the move, running his hands along furniture edges, checking that nothing wobbled, testing the stability of her bookshelf. Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, noting how his presence filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size and everything to do with the way her apartment suddenly felt more like home with him in it. "Everything looks good," he said after his inspection, which had been surprisingly thorough for a manufactured excuse. "Solid placement, should hold for years." "Good to know," Sarah replied, though neither of them moved toward the door. They stood in her living room, surrounded by the furniture they'd arranged together, the silence stretching between them like a question neither was quite ready to ask. Sarah felt the familiar flutter in her stomach. the same nervous energy that had kept her distracted at work for the past 3 days. "I made coffee," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "If you want some. I mean, if you have time before your next appointment." Marcus smiled, slow and genuine, and Sarah realized he probably didn't have another appointment. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that a lot." The admission hung in the air between them, honest in its simplicity, dangerous in its implications. The coffee maker gurgled to life as morning sunlight streamed through Sarah's kitchen window, casting golden rectangles across the small table where Marcus sat with his hands wrapped around a mug she'd finally unpacked the night before. He'd arrived an hour ago with bagels and the excuse of checking her kitchen appliances, but they both knew the real reason he kept finding ways back to her door. "He used to time me," Sarah said suddenly, the words spilling out like water through a crack she couldn't quite seal. "How long it took me to make coffee, to get dressed, to decide what to order at restaurants. Said I was inefficient." Marcus looked up from his bagel, his dark eyes steady and patient. "Sounds exhausting." It was. Sarah poured herself coffee, using the familiar ritual to steady her hands. "I started second-guessing everything, whether I was reading the right books, wearing the right clothes, having the right thoughts. By the end, I felt like I was disappearing into someone else's idea of who I should be." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Marcus watched her with the same careful attention. He'd shown her belongings during the move, like she was something worth protecting. "My ex used to say I wasn't ambitious enough," he said quietly, surprising her with the admission. Keisha had big plans: law school, corporate job, house in the suburbs. Said my moving business was beneath her potential. Sarah set down her mug, studying his face. "How long were you together?" 3 years. Lived together for 2. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "She'd introduced me as her friend at her work events. Said she didn't want people to get the wrong impression about her standards." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about the way her ex-husband had dismissed her writing, how he'd roll his eyes when she mentioned wanting to try new things, take risks, live differently. "I'm sorry, that must have been humiliating," Marcus finished. "Made me feel like I had to prove my worth every day, like loving her wasn't enough if I couldn't also be someone else." Sarah reached across the table without thinking, her fingers brushing against his knuckles. His skin was warm, slightly rough from work, and when he turned his hand palm up to catch hers, she felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for months. "Maybe that's why this feels different," she said softly. "You've never once made me feel like I need to be anyone other than who I am." Marcus threaded their fingers together, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her skin. "Same goes for you." The simple acknowledgement hung between them, fragile and honest, like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil. The movie had become background noise an hour ago, forgotten dialogue competing with the sound of Sarah's heartbeat as she sat curled against Marcus on her couch. The soft lamplight painted everything in warm gold, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath her cheek, where it rested against his shoulder. His arm curved around her waist, fingers absently tracing patterns against her hip that made her skin burn through the thin fabric of her t-shirt. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough in a way that made something low in her belly tighten with want. She lifted her head to look at him, and the intensity in his dark eyes made her breath catch. They'd been dancing around this moment for weeks now. Stolen glances, lingering touches, conversations that said everything except what they both really meant. But now, in the intimate cocoon of lamplight and shared silence, the careful distance they'd maintained seemed suddenly ridiculous. "I know," she whispered, though he hadn't asked a question. Marcus's hand moved to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. I don't want to rush this. Don't want to be something you regret when the morning comes. Consideration in his voice, the way he put her comfort before his own desire, made Sarah's chest ache with something deeper than want. She leaned into his touch, eyes fluttering closed at the warmth of his palm against her skin. You won't be, she said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. You couldn't be. The distance between them disappeared gradually, like tide meeting shore. Marcus's other hand tangled in her hair as she shifted closer, her palms flat against his chest where she could feel his heart racing beneath her touch. When their lips finally met, it was soft at first, tentative, a question asked and answered in the space of a breath. Then something ignited between them, 3 weeks of careful restraint dissolving into desperate hands and quiet gasps. Sarah's fingers found the hem of his shirt, but when she started to pull it upward, Marcus caught her wrists gently, breaking the kiss with visible effort. Wait, he breathed against her lips, forehead resting against hers. God, I want to, but... Sarah's chest rose and fell rapidly, her body still humming with need, but she saw the struggle in his eyes and understood. They'd both been broken by people who'd taken too much too fast, who'd confused intensity with intimacy. You're right, she said, though everything in her protested the words. We should take this slow. Marcus pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, holding her close. Doesn't mean I want you any less. I know, Sarah whispered against his neck. I know. Dawn light filtered through Sarah's bedroom curtains like watercolor bleeding through paper, painting Marcus's dark skin in shades of amber and gold as he lay beside her. One arm curved protectively around her waist. The sheets twisted around their bodies told the story of the night before, how their careful restraint had finally crumbled when he'd kissed her goodbye at the door and she'd pulled him back inside, how they'd moved together with desperate tenderness until the world outside ceased to exist. Now, in the vulnerable quiet of early morning, Sarah studied the peaceful lines of his face while he slept, memorizing the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks, the gentle curve of his lips that had whispered her name like a prayer in the darkness. Her body still hummed with the memory of his touch, every nerve ending alive and singing. But beneath the physical satisfaction lay something more complex, a flutter of panic that felt dangerously close to falling. Marcus stirred beside her, dark eyes opening slowly before focusing on her face with an intensity that made her heart skip. Hey, he said softly, voice rough with sleep. Hey yourself, Sarah whispered back, suddenly conscious of her tangled hair and the vulnerability of lying naked beside this man who'd somehow become essential to her breathing. Marcus's hand found hers beneath the sheets, fingers intertwining with familiar ease. You okay? You look like you're thinking too hard. Sarah wanted to lie, to keep things light and uncomplicated, but something about the gentle concern in his eyes made honesty spill out instead. I'm terrified, she admitted. Last night it was beautiful, perfect, and that scares me more than if it had been terrible. Marcus shifted closer, his free hand coming up to brush a strand of hair from her face. Because beautiful things can be taken away. The understanding in his voice nearly undid her. Because I don't know how to hold on to something good without squeezing too tight and breaking it, Sarah. Marcus pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, lips lingering against her skin. I'm not going anywhere. Not because of last night. Not in spite of it. I'm here because I want to be here. What if I'm not ready for this? What if I mess it up like I did my marriage? Then we'll figure it out together, Marcus said simply. One day at a time. No pressure, no expectations beyond what we give each. Other freely. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the patience in his voice, the way he offered her space to be afraid without judgment. She pressed closer to him, skin against skin, letting his steady heartbeat anchor her against the storm of her own thoughts. I don't want to lose this, she whispered against his chest. You won't, Marcus murmured into her hair. We won't. The text from Marcus came while Sarah was having lunch with her friend Jessica, the phone buzzing against the cafe table like an unwelcome interruption. Running late tonight. Big job went sideways. Rain check on dinner. Sarah's stomach dropped as she typed back a quick, "Of course, no problem." But Jessica had already noticed the shift in her expression. "Let me guess," Jessica said, stirring. Her salad with pointed precision. "The moving guy again. His name is Marcus," Sarah said quietly, sliding her phone back into her purse. "Right, Marcus." Jessica's tone carried the weight of weeks of barely concealed disapproval. "Sarah, honey, I have to ask, what exactly are you doing here? You just got out of a marriage. You're supposed to be finding yourself, not diving headfirst into another relationship." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's not like that. We're taking things slow." "Are you? Because you've been seeing him almost every day for 3 weeks. That doesn't sound slow to me." The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. Sarah had fallen into a rhythm with Marcus that felt natural, but maybe wasn't wise. Morning coffee before he headed to work, dinner together most evenings, lazy Sunday mornings that stretched into afternoon. When had her life started revolving? Around his schedule. "You don't understand," Sarah started, but Jessica held up a hand. "I understand that you're vulnerable right now. And I understand that rebound relationships feel real when you're in them, but this isn't a rebound," Sarah snapped, louder than she'd intended. The couple at the next table glanced over, and she lowered her voice. "Marcus isn't some random guy I picked up to fill a void. He's kind and patient, and he's a moving guy, Sarah. What do you two even have in common? What happens when the novelty wears off and you realize you're from completely different worlds?" Later that evening, alone in her apartment for the first time in weeks, Sarah found herself looking around the space with fresh eyes. The furniture Marcus had helped arrange, the coffee mugs they'd shared, the couch where they'd watched movies and talked until late into the night. Suddenly, it all felt precarious, like a life she was borrowing rather than building. Her phone buzzed again. Marcus sending a photo of himself covered in mud with the caption, "Glamorous life of a businessman." Usually his messages made her smile, but tonight she stared at the image and heard Jessica's voice asking what they had in common. Sarah set the phone aside without responding, wrapping her arms around herself as the apartment settled into silence. For the first time since moving day, the quiet felt heavy again, filled with questions she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. Marcus knew something had shifted the moment Sarah opened her door. She stood in the doorway like a stranger, greeting an unexpected visitor, her smile polite but distant, missing the warmth that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. The apartment behind her looked the same, furniture in the places they'd arranged together, soft lamplight casting familiar shadows. But the air between them felt different, charged with intention that had nothing to do with desire. "Hey," he said softly, studying her face for clues to the change he could feel but couldn't name. "Hi." Sarah stepped aside to let him in, but didn't move close enough for their usual greeting, the brief kiss or gentle touch that had become second nature. "How was your day?" The question felt scripted, like she was reading lines from a play she'd rather not be performing. Marcus set down the takeout bag he'd brought, watching as she busied herself in the kitchen, movements precise but somehow brittle. "Long," he answered, though what he really wanted to ask was why she felt so far away, despite standing just 3 feet from him. That job in Clearwater turned into a 2-day nightmare. Flooded basement, damaged boxes, insurance paperwork. Sarah nodded, pulling plates from the cabinet with unnecessary focus. "That sounds stressful." The polite distance in her voice made his chest tighten. This was how she'd talked to him on moving day, before they'd learned each other's rhythms, before they'd built something that felt real and necessary and good. "Sarah." Marcus moved closer, close enough to catch the familiar scent of her shampoo, to see the tension in her shoulders. "What's wrong?" She turned to face him, and for a moment her carefully constructed composure cracked. He saw fear in her, eyes raw and honest, before she looked away again. "Nothing's wrong," she said, but her voice wavered. "I just think maybe we've been spending too much time together. Maybe we should slow things down." The words hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting something like this since she'd stopped responding to his texts with her usual warmth. Marcus nodded slowly, recognizing the retreat for what it was. Not an ending, but a pulling back, a protective measure from someone who'd been hurt before. "Okay," he said quietly, "if that's what you need." Sarah's eyes snapped to his, surprised by his acceptance. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Marcus stepped back, giving her the space she was asking for, even though every instinct told him to fight for what they'd built. "I care about you too much to make you feel trapped." The kindness in his voice made Sarah's composure finally crumble, tears spilling down her cheeks as she realized what she was pushing away. 3 weeks without Marcus and Sarah's apartment felt like a museum again, all carefully arranged furniture and echoing silence. She sat cross-legged on the couch they'd positioned together, staring at the coffee table where takeout containers had once created an impromptu dining room, where his hands had gestured as he told stories about impossible moving jobs and difficult clients. Now the surface held only a single mug, growing cold, while she pretended to read the same page of a book she'd started and abandoned 6 times since he'd walked out her door. The silence pressed against her ears the way it had in those first days, after moving in, but this emptiness felt different, sharper. Before Marcus, the quiet had been neutral, just absence waiting to be filled. Now it ached with the memory of his laughter, the gentle rumble of his voice asking about her day, the soft sound of his breathing when he dozed during Sunday afternoon movies. Sarah's phone buzzed on the cushion beside her, a text from Jessica, asking if she wanted to grab drinks to celebrate her freedom from what Jessica still insisted on calling her rebound relationship. Sarah deleted the message without responding, the word freedom sitting bitter on her tongue. This wasn't freedom. This was the prison she'd built out of fear and other people's expectations. She walked to the kitchen window, looking down at the parking lot where Marcus's truck had once sat most evenings, work boots visible through the windshield, tool belt hanging from the passenger seat. A moving truck was parked there now, different company, unfamiliar logo, and she found herself searching the crew below for his familiar silhouette before remembering he wouldn't be there. The lemon tree in her small backyard caught her attention, heavy with fruit that had ripened while she'd been too distracted by loneliness to notice. Marcus had mentioned wanting to help her harvest them, had talked about making fresh lemonade together when summer hit full swing. Now the lemons hung untouched, growing heavy and sweet while she stood inside her carefully arranged life, surrounded by furniture that still bore the invisible imprint of his hands. Sarah pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching a neighbor load boxes into a sedan, starting over somewhere new. She thought about beginnings and endings, about the courage it took to pack up everything familiar and trust that something better waited on the other side. 3 months ago, she'd been brave enough to leave a marriage that was slowly erasing her. But when it came to fighting for something that could save her, she'd chosen the safety of solitude over the risk of love. The realization hit her like cold water. She hadn't been protecting herself from Marcus. She'd been protecting herself from the possibility of being truly, completely happy. Sarah stood outside Marcus's apartment door at 7:30 on a Thursday evening, holding a bag of lemons from her backyard tree and trying to remember how to breathe. The hallway smelled like cooking spices and old carpet, sounds of television and conversation drifting through thin walls. She'd driven here on impulse after 3 weeks of sleepless nights, her hands shaking as she'd picked the ripest fruit, and rehearsed apologies that felt inadequate for the damage she'd done. The door opened before she could knock, Marcus appearing in worn jeans and a t-shirt that stretched across shoulders she'd memorized with her fingertips. His eyes widened. When he saw her and she watched emotions flicker across his face. Surprise, hope, wariness. The careful distance he'd maintained when he'd walked out of her life was still there, but softer now, like armor he was willing to remove if she gave him reason. Sarah. Her name sounded different in his voice, cautious, but not unwelcoming. "I brought lemons," she said, then felt heat flood her cheeks at the absurdity of it. "I mean, I know that's not why I'm here, but you'd mentioned wanting to make lemonade, and they were just hanging there getting overripe while I was being an idiot." Marcus looked down at the bag in her hands, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "An idiot, huh?" "The worst kind," Sarah said, meeting his eyes. "The kind who gets scared and pushes away the best thing that's happened to her in years. The kind who listens to other people's opinions instead of trusting her own heart." Marcus stepped aside, gesturing her into his apartment. It was smaller than hers, but warm and lived in, with photographs on the walls and books stacked on a coffee table scarred with water rings. She could see his life here. Morning coffee at a small kitchen table, evening news from a couch that looked comfortable, rather than stylish. "I missed you," she said simply, setting the lemons on his counter. "I missed everything about you. The way you make coffee, the way you listen without trying to fix everything, the way you make me feel like I'm worth staying for." Marcus moved, closer. Close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "I missed you too. But Sarah, I can't go through that again. The pushing away, the retreat every time things get real." "I know," she said, reaching for his hands. "I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to let me prove I'm ready to fight for this instead of running from it." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, then squeezed her fingers gently. "One day at a time?" "One day at a time," Sarah agreed, and when he smiled, she felt her heart remember what home was supposed to feel like.